You see, the one thing about making a docu-series about the rise and fall of the British National Party is that, quite apart from it concluding matters, it actually throws up even more queries and demands for people to say, oh, can you continue making loads and loads and loads more of these episodes? No, I'm sorry, I can't. You know, I don't want to bore anyone to death, quite frankly. I've covered the main points, but what I will say is this, in terms of the questions people have asked. There was no alternative for the British National Party than to purge C18 when it did. It had to happen because the British National Party was never going to adopt a policy of openly supporting National Socialism. It was a death knell, quite frankly. You know, the British will never accept it. They will never embrace it. And those who are ideologically committed to National Socialism, well, that's fair enough. That's entirely up to you. But out there, you know, the British masses are not going to back National Socialism at the ballot box. I absolutely guarantee you it is never going to happen. And so the BNP committed itself to the path of nationalism, not fascism either, and certainly not National Socialism. And there are other reasons as well. You know, C18 by that time was infiltrated, it was compromised. Some years ago, I was contacted by a former SAS sergeant using an alias who told me about how he was deployed inside C18 for the counter-revolutionary warfare wing to stop a suspected political assassination on a Labour MP, which in actual fact turned out to be wholly false, in his words. I know his real name. I won't disclose it. I also know his cover name, and there's no need to name drop that either. And, you know, there's also a connection there to his brother and an incident when I was in the British Army. And so, look, at the end of the day, it's like this. C18 had to go. It had to follow its own path. It had become extremely violent. All it was committed to was violent National Socialism. It wanted an armed revolution, quite frankly, which could never succeed. And John Tyndall was absolutely right about that. And he told them it would never succeed and it would end in absolute disaster, which is exactly what happened in actual fact, didn't it? So that is why C18 had to leave and the British National Party had to go away on another path. And yes, of course, you know, it was very difficult for the BNP after that, having lost, you know, so many members and activists, particularly of the type that some of the C18 were, you know, who had a completely no-nonsense approach towards the Reds, particularly when they were trying to attack BNP meetings. But in truth, Charlie Sargent, who was flipped by MI5 later, according to the former Tory Defence Minister, Alan Clark, who met Tyndall once a month for dinner in London. Look, at the end of the day, he was simply trying to take over the BNP. And when he failed to do so, he obviously fell into, I guess you could say, well, fell in league with Blood and Honour. And that was purely, as far as I know, and I do know very well about this, to get his hands on the lucrative revenue coming from the skinhead music scene, quite frankly. And there was an enormous amount of trouble there, conflict, violence, infighting, all over money and drugs everywhere. Litany, you know, of criminality, quite frankly, which the British National Party simply could not ever foster and embrace. It had to go. And that was the BNP's principal problem. You know, and there was also another problem, which I didn't raise in the docu-series in actual fact, was that, you know, there were frequent arguments between Richard Edmonds and John Morse on one side and John Tyndall on the other side about the appearance of skinheads on BNP rallies and demonstrations. Tyndall didn't want them. He said they were bad news. They were bad optics. They just gave the BNP a very bad image because the press always focused in on them, plastered as they were in this neo-Nazi paraphernalia, and he wanted them gone. And that was the law that he laid down, quite literally. only for it to be disobeyed frequently by Edmonds and Morse. And this caused another massive schism in actual fact. And I think it was quite debatable at one time during the split with the NS, with C18, whether Morse and Edmonds would go with them. But obviously sanity prevailed, I think. And, they stayed in the BNP. I mean, John Morse, frankly, he was a very difficult person to work with. Very intense character, in actual fact. Never really had an awful lot to do with him, in all honesty. Edmonds was a much more personable chap, very friendly, very interactive, and very popular. But my policy was also the same as Tyndall's. I was a Tyndall loyalist at that time. I explained why I stopped being a Tyndall loyalist, but I shared his thinking on the skinheads, in actual fact, and National Socialism, full stop. It was just bad news all round, and it needed to go. They were not a political party. They'd come over from Blood and Honour, quite frankly, and Ian Stewart Donaldson was obviously supplying the BNP with money on a frequent basis, from his music revenue. And of course that he felt that gave him a right to have his people there. And the BNP was never going to make any electoral headway whilst the NS were around. And later, remember, when Griffin at the helm, although it wasn't entirely his doing, obviously, it was a party effort, a team effort. It was teamwork, 100%. When they got over 1 million votes, that was done without any involvement with the overt involvement with the NS and also skinheads everywhere. The BNP had tried to clean up its act significantly and had done so in actual fact. But even then, the media just printed the same old line about the BNP the whole time and backed UKIP, talked up UKIP in parallel to push it ahead of the BNP. And so that policy of I could say purging the National Socialists from the British National Party simply had to happen. It was unavoidable, and it did happen, and it was very unpleasant. And the BNP, I think, ultimately was a lot better off for it as a political party, because then afterwards it ceased to be a paramilitary in actual fact. But my time had already come to an end when that happened, for the reasons I explained in the docu-series. And so I don't think there's anything to lament over at all. And if you actually look at what Kenny Smith and the Homeland Party are trying to do right now with sensible nationalism, grassroots campaigning, that is the only type of nationalism that can ever succeed in this country. All that radical stuff, forget it. Unless you want to be in an esoteric niche society, and that's fair enough if that's what you want, but you are never going to succeed at the ballot box with that. I assure you, it will not work. And that is why the BNP carried out this very, fractious divorce, which caused so much trouble, in actual fact, in late 1993 and 94. But it was absolutely necessary, and it had to happen. And no, C18 simply could not stay in the party. And as I said in the docu-series, even my own 2IC had joined C18 without informing me at all, in actual fact. And I no longer trusted him in any way, shape or form at all. And that's another thing that it did in the party, is it engendered, a sheer lack of trust. The whole organisation became a low-trust society. And when that happens, it's heading for disintegration. And so it was absolutely the right policy to get C18 and the NS out of the BNP and into the arms of Blood and Honour, where they belonged in actual fact. And as far as I'm aware, that's where they still are, isn't it? They're bedfellows. And as I said before, and I reiterate, the BNP never had any intention whatsoever to create an armed paramilitary wing called Combat 18. John Tyndall asked us to create stewarding groups, not paramilitary organisations, stewarding groups, to use force to protect BNP meetings. At no time did he ever give any instruction of any description to anyone in the BNP, telling them to form paramilitaries and to acquire, goodness knows, whatever, to further a paramilitary campaign. And I didn't want to be part of it either. And I trust that clarifies the matter. And we all know the history, don't we, of Charlie Sargent, you know, and C18 and what happened there. And I think that best explains it more than anything else, why it had to go, doesn't it?